The election is over. Donald Trump, 312 popular, 312 electoral college votes to Kamala Harris is 226. Uh, Trump got 76 million votes. Harris 74 million. Trump, I believe, outperformed by between 2 and 3%, with Harris underperforming about by the same margin. Let's get, in fact, she didn't win one swing state, not nary swing state. Let's get some real analysis on this outcome instead of the wishful thinking based chatter we've been hearing via so many outlets and platforms. My next guest holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Armed Struggle: Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and the 70s. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
Before we get to the election, I want to just quickly hit a point. The story broke, I think, late yesterday or early this morning. This is from the Hindustan Times. Biden's last meeting with Xi focuses on North Korea and China-Russia cooperation concerns. Biden is expected to urge China's Xi Jinping to curb North Korea's support for Russia. Dr. Horne, how in the world could President Biden go to President Xi and have that conversation? Because Xi's response, I think, would simply be, well, if you didn't start the fight in the first place, you wouldn't find yourself in this mess. Dr. Horne.
Well, it's a fool's errand, not atypical of Mr. Biden, I'm afraid. That is to say that everyone knows, including Xi Jinping, that the strategic objective of U.S. imperialism going forward, be it under Biden or Trump, is to destabilize the Chinese Communist Party and the country that Mr. Xi Jinping heads. So why should Xi Jinping do any favors for U.S. imperialism with regard to their confrontation in Ukraine, which reportedly involves Moscow dispatching troops from North Korea to that land? And in any case, North Korea is a sovereign country and very prickly about their sovereignty, as those who studied the U.S. intervention there from 1950 to 1953 well know. And so I'm not sure what was on Mr. Biden's mind when he reportedly made these overtures. Perhaps it's indication that he's lost or is losing his fastball.
Thank you. And folks, from all the research I've been able to do, these stories about North Korean troops fighting Ukrainian troops and on the front, that's all a bunch of hooey. I have not seen any credible data to support those stories. That's not misinformation, folks. That's disinformation. They are intentionally lying to you about that issue. With that, let's move on to the issues at hand. Dr. Horne, not only did Trump MAGA prevail, but they took control of the Senate. By the last projections I've seen, 52 to 47. Republicans have taken control of the Senate. NBC projects they won in West Virginia and Ohio. Democrats previously held a narrow margin, a majority in the Senate. They also lost the House 2024, 218 to 212. So Republicans will retain control of the House. So first of all, simple question, your overall thoughts on this outcome, and were you surprised?
No, I was not surprised. Overall, it would take a few more moments. I have a 50-year analysis, a 75-year analysis, a 250-year analysis, and a 500-year analysis. In any case, I think that the view from 30,000 feet is that in some ways it was a change election. Mr. Trump was pledging that he would return the United States to the halcyon days of the past, make America great again. Recall that his favorite president, Andrew Jackson, 200 years ago, swept Cherokee out of the southeast quadrant of North America to today's Georgia, even though they had assimilated up to and including enslaving Africans. and they were forced on the Trail of Tears to move to so-called Indian Territory, today's Oklahoma, and you had Europeans fresh off the boat moving into their homes. Now, Mr. Trump, seeking to emulate that, has pledged that he'll sweep millions of undocumented workers, undocumented migrants out of their homes, and presumably the Trump base, emulating what happened 200 years ago, can move into their homes. Now, the Democrats, of course, were left to promote status quo plus. That is to say, you've never had it so good in terms of unemployment, we were told, and even in terms of inflation, but there will be some tweaks at the margins. That did not necessarily prevail, but I think we should not overlook the fact that 9 out of 10 Black women did not vote for Mr. Trump and his look backwards into the past. 8 out of 10 Black men, despite all of the brouhaha ignited by Mr. Obama, they voted against the Republicans as well. In any case, the international situation, as ever, is going to be very tricky for Washington to navigate. And I think that it's going to provide formidable barriers to any sorts of ambitions that the Trumpistas would like to put forward.
What about the narrative from the Harris campaign? And it was started by the Biden campaign early in the, April, May, and June, that the economy was doing so well and that people just didn't get it. And yesterday I was in the grocery store, and one of the metrics I use is how much am I going to pay for a pound of tomatoes? And yesterday tomatoes were $3.50 a pound. So I'm sorry, 3.49. My bad. So how did they even think they could square that message that, folks, the economy's doing great, you all just don't get it?
Well, there's some blinkered thinking amongst the Democrats. Let me punch up and not punch down or horizontally by pointing to some of the recent remarks of Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, a presidential hopeful, who said that the Democrats got enmeshed in so-called identity politics and ignored the class question. Now, first of all, I'm not sure what identity politics, what that means. I hear it applied all the time.
Right.
It may mean the Black liberation movement. It may mean Black Lives Matter, which means that Mr. Sanders is reduced to attacking his base, given the importance of the Black community to the Democratic Party told us. Perhaps he was pointing to the trans community, because Republicans ran so many ads on transgender issues, and perhaps Mr. Sanders feels uncomfortable by attacking that besieged minority. And you may have heard the comments of Mr. Trump, who said, you send little Johnny to school in the morning, and then little Johnny comes back in the afternoon as little Jennifer. Performs operation. And the low information voters, those masters of gullibility, apparently went for that.
And Donald Trump campaigned on, I love the uninformed, I love the uneducated. He was very clear on that point.
Well, clearly. And with regard to this point, identity politics, part of this blinkered thinking among certain Democrats, particularly many of our friends on the left, Israel is a state based upon an exclusivist ethno-religious identity. I've never heard one person refer to Israel as being the embodiment of identity politics. And not only that, but it bleeds into these other demagogic terms like anti-critical race theory, anti-DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-wokeness. And it just so happens, according to the Wall Street Journal, that the incoming Pentagon chief, Pete Hegseth, he Islamophobia, and of course, we need to have a word with our friends in Michigan who thought that in voting for Trump, they were voting for, I guess, anti-Islamophobia, but it's not embodied in the defense chief. But in any case, he's talking about purging generals who exemplify wokeness so that generals will be more pliable in being able to ignore the Constitution and be unleashed against domestic anti-Trump protesters. And so Mr. Sanders and some of our erstwhile comrades on the left are really fanning the flames of their own demise. Not only are they involved in attacking their base, they're ultimately seeking to undermine themselves.
Dr. Horne, Back, I want to say it was in April, APAC published a piece in the New York Times and other major American newspapers saying that they were going to spend $100 million targeting and influencing the outcome of the Democratic Party primary. And we lost Jamal Bowman, we lost Cori Bush. I believe that the first gentleman, Doug Emhoff, is an APAC lobbyist. So when you look at the Harris campaign's position towards Gaza, it's no mystery why, contrary to the overwhelming positions taken not only by Americans but by Democrats against genocide in Gaza, why her campaign took the position that it's taken. So I'm saying to people who are sitting home, wringing their hands, crying in their beer, praying to a deity about what to do now, call APAC. Since y'all, didn't seem to get it when they told you what they were going to do, you want to know what you're going to do now? Call APAC. See what they do for you. See if they answer the phone. Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, clearly the Israeli lobby has deep and profound influence in both political parties.
Mm-hmm.
Need look no further than Miriam Adelson, the casino magnate who funds both Trump and Mr. Netanyahu, and by the way, has considerable interest in the People's Republic of China, a la Elon Musk's first buddy, which opens up certain points to pressure her and them. And then on the Democratic side, you have a lot of Hollywood money, such as Jeffrey Katzenberg, a former executive with Disney, a partner of Uber film director Steven Spielberg. He helped to fund the mayoral campaign of Karen Bass, the Black woman mayor of Los Angeles. And money talks. And therefore, it's very difficult for these Democrats to buck the Israeli lobby. Although, once again, I have to raise the point of some of our friends in Dearborn, Michigan, Detroit, Michigan, et cetera, who apparently went for the okie doke and somehow think that because Mr. Trump has Lebanese billionaire in-laws, that is to say, Tiffany Trump is just married into that family that has considerable interest in West Africa, Nigeria, by the way, that somehow that will overcome the in-laws, the Kushners, the Zionist Kushners, by the way, who of course are close to the Saudis. I think that some of our Arab and Arab American friends are going to be sorely disappointed, to put it mildly.
In my latest op-ed, Requiem for a Failed Presidential Campaign and a Party, I make the point, don't ask why Harris lost. Ask yourself why this, quote, race-baiting, xenophobic, religious bigot won again. And that's not my language. That's the language from his so-called allies, Senators Lindsey Graham, Ted Cruz, and Senators Perry. So am I right to change the focus not to why she lost, which of course is an important point, and that's the focus of my piece, but you also need to ask yourself, how did this guy do it and do it again in even larger margins than the first time? Dr. Horne.
Well, it brings us to a rather sour analysis of a certain segment of the body politic, even setting aside the tens of millions who did not vote. We cannot ignore the 74, 75 million who voted for Mr. Trump in 2020, 2024. As noted, it depends on where you want to start the story. For example, you can start the story 75 years ago with the Red Scare leading to a purge of progressive trade unionists, which has weakened the wage structure and the working conditions. You can start 50 years ago with the deal with China, which led to massive foreign direct investment of U.S. corporations in the People's Republic of China, entire manufacturing plants floating across the Pacific to bulwark this rising Asian giant. And of course, although no one wants to admit it, not only was this bipartisan, that is to say, Democrats and Republicans, it was tripartisan. A lot of people on the left, like Bernie Sanders, for example, supported these maneuvers, which has obviously soured a good deal of the U.S. working class, making them more vulnerable to the entreaties of a demagogue. And of course, you can start with the origin of the United States 250 years ago, based upon mass enslavement and mass dispossession of indigenous and enriching a certain sliver of European migrants, who, of course, have gotten accustomed to that kind of privileged behavior to the point where they see attacks on white supremacy as basically an attack on human nature. So there are many different possible explanations for the pickle we're now in. The question is, what is the way out?
And that's my next question, because I it, so to those pundits and the strategists in the African American community and in the Democratic Party, so what y'all gonna do now? We've got the 2026 midterms, if we're all still around, and I expect that Trump will have struck once again and demonstrated once again that he is, as Lindsey Graham said, a race baiting xenophobic religious bigot. Um, Also, I see the issue here really being the tilling of the political landscape for J.D. Vance. So I go back to that old line from Richard Pryor, which I'll clean up a little bit. So what you gonna do now, little brother? You done messed up the game. What to do looking forward as opposed to sitting here crying in your beer, Dr. Gerald Horne?
Well, first of all, the Black community is heavily exposed, voting more profoundly than any other demographic against Mr. Trump, although he tips his hat to Christianity and the Almighty being saying that vengeance is mine. Mr. Trump says, no, vengeance is mine. And
Mm-hmm.
so we can expect to be hit back with a mighty punch. However, what I'm going to propose is utterly doable, but I'm afraid to say that the current leadership is quaking in their boots and too scared to pursue it. What I mean is, obviously, an immediate objective should be to halt the mass deportations, not least of the hundreds of thousands of Haitians back to their homeland, now in chaos. I'm proposing that in either Ottawa or Havana, perhaps both, that the NAACP, Congressional Black Caucus, call a conference that has that as an agenda item. Mr. Trump has many antagonists abroad, in Canada, for example, which is worried about the slapping of tariffs on their exports in the United States, which will wreck their economy, not to mention Mexico, European Union, France, Russia, China, Cuba, of course. But our rather narrow-minded parochial leadership does not think outside of the four corners of the United States of America, and it's left us, their constituents, terribly exposed.
So basically, there is no leadership for all intents and purposes. Because again, I haven't heard anything, haven't seen anything as it relates to the so-called leadership and the collective, whether it be the Urban League, whether it be the NAACP, pick one. I don't see anybody coming to the mic saying, "Okay, we got to rally the forces. Here's how we're going to do this." I just don't hear it, Dr. Horne.
Well, they've forgotten the lessons of history. Perhaps they never knew the lessons of history, which is that we were able to escape from slavery through international campaigning, Frederick Douglass spending considerable time in the then U.S. antagonists, speaking of London, England. We escaped Jim Crow, not least because of folks like Paul Robeson aligning with the socialist camp, which creates enormous pressure in the United States to retreat from the more egregious aspects of that system of U.S. apartheid. But alas, as part of that compromise of 1954, you had the NAACP leadership that helped to throw Robeson overboard and then accepted this liberal bromide that whenever anything happens that seems untoward, well, the mantra, as Mr. Obama used to frequently say, all too frequently, that's not who we are.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're going to be saying that's not who we are quite a bit going forward post mid-January 2025 if we're not careful.
Dr. Horne, let's go to line one, and I think that's excessive Anthony. Anthony, is that you on one? Anthony. Anthony, talk to me.
Hello there.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I wanted to call in and give my little piece as to why Mrs. Harris lost the election. First of
Okay,
all,
go
I would
ahead.
say that as a long-time political person, I've been in campaign since the late 60s. As a teenager, right, and I'm in my 70s, and degrees in political science, worked in many, many campaigns in about 7 states. I am saying that she did an excellent job for running the campaign in 100 days. Most candidates, it's more than a year they had to do that, what she did. But nevertheless, I think one of the reasons, not the only one, but one of the major reasons is that she didn't have maybe they had and they were not forced to a rapid reaction force that most candidates have nowadays. And Democrats tend to be weak in that area. They've been coming around to doing it. When Trump them says a lot of negative things, whether it be on a football game where you have millions of people watching, they should have a reaction to come back and nail something negative about him. They ran that kind of campaign with upbeat. That's in politics, but you got to have in the age that we're living in politics. They have to have a more negative reaction force, and I thought the DNC had come up with that, but they did a very poor job of that because she had ample money. I don't think they spent enough money. They spent more than Mrs. Clinton people did. I call those guys around Mrs. Clinton. Mrs. Clinton got 8 years ago from my long years in politics. I call them arrogant, and there are more of them than black people who are put in that category. They screwed up her campaign and refused. Donna Brazil said that in her book, and when they criticized Donna Brazil on Twitter, she literally tell him, kiss where the sun doesn't shine. She told him go to hell, which is a nice way of saying something else. But I think these guys, they had a lot more money. They could have done a better job of recruiting people. There was a cutoff in the amount of people that turned out, and not only in white areas that they would have voted for, and in black areas in the city. They didn't spend enough. They didn't put enough time. They waited too damn late. So she didn't do too bad. She got 75 million votes. So I think that they did a pretty good job for it, but those guys failed who ran the campaign. The same old arrogant ass.
Appreciate it. Yeah. Got it. Thank you, Anthony. Appreciate it. Dr. Horne.
Well, I'd prefer to hear another caller, although obviously 74 million votes does not measure up to the 81 million that Mr. Biden got in 2020. And the question is why?
And the answer is?
Well, she had to defend Mr. Biden's record and Mr. Biden himself, which was lacking in many respects. But once again, I prefer to hear the next caller.
Let's go to Mike in Maryland on 7. Mike in Maryland, talk to me. Mike. Mike.
Hello, I'm here. Yeah,
go ahead.
Real quickly, I stated that you need to stop using your listening audience. I had the utmost respect for you, my brother, but I got to call it like it is. You stated that you expected Kamala to win the election by over 300 electoral votes.
I did, yeah.
And the thing about it is, relative to that, what caused that not to happen? Even brother Professor Gerald Horne, he stated in the positive about how 90% of black women voted for Kamala, and making it seem like 80% of black men, but more black men voted for Trump this year than ever before for a Republican candidate. So we need to unpack this to reality. I listen to you, I respect you, and when you come back and and make these comments and you talk about identity politics, that's how Trump won. Identity politics, meaning that us against them. And that's how it's always been.
Okay, all right, okay. Now, so let me ask you this. Did you hear me last week explain what the basis of my mistake?
No.
Did you hear me?
Saying that, but no.
So
I probably did, but no. Hold on, brother. Can I just say this real quickly?
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Either you heard me explain my mistake, or you didn't hear me explain my mistake. Which is it? Did you hear me, or didn't you hear me? Because I came back and clearly explained and stated I was wrong in my projection, and here's why I was wrong. Did you hear me say that?
No, I don't remember hearing it.
Okay,
but
well
what
then
I'm referring to is what I'm referring to is the continuum. Because if I had never heard you before in the past, and I'm listening to you today, I would have the impression that you have never said that she would have gotten.
Well, but then, okay, Mike, I appreciate it. Let's go to Dr. Horne because, thank you, Mike, because I clearly said, first of all, I said this was on about the 20, well, it was after Donald Trump's racist hate fest in New York on the 26th of October. And I said, based upon that, that just pure vitriol and racism, I expected the Latino community to be outraged and turn out in greater numbers to offset what was projected to be low support by the African American community. I was very clear in making that point. I also said that looking at the early voting numbers, early voting historically tended to work in favor of Democrats. That high early voting turnout tended to support Democrats. I was wrong because Donald Trump used early voting to his benefit, where in the previous campaign he had run against it. I said those two factors contributed greatly to my miscalculation. I said that. So I don't know what the beef is. Go ahead, Dr. Horne.
Well, they're lies, damn lies, and statistics. I mean, the black male vote voted 8-2 against Mr. Trump. The caller wants to focus on the two, whereas if every constituency had voted like black men, Mr. Trump would be on his way to prison instead of the White House. So I don't think we should be trying to throw dust in the eyes or in the ears, for that matter, of
Correct.
the audience.
So again, man, I just try to tell you all the truth as I see it, as we're speaking it. And Mike, if that now bothers you, I'm sorry that it does. Dr. Horne, President-elect Trump has now come out and announced a number of his potential cabinet nominees. He's got Lil Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, Pete Hegseth as the Secretary of Defense, Matt Gaetz as Attorney General, Doug Burgum as the Secretary of Interior, Robert Kennedy Jr. as HHS Secretary. And folks, HHS has an awful lot to do with public health. And so when you nominate someone to be your Secretary of Health and Human Services, and that person has absolutely no background in public health, that's insane. Dr. Horne.
Well, let's start in terms of this rogues gallery with Mr. Hegseth, who, as you probably know, has a fondness for the Crusades. It has a tattoo from the Crusade period, that is to say, this period 1,000 years ago, when extremist Christians sought to reclaim what they call the Holy Land from Islamic forces. I would urge and encourage our friends in Dearborn, Michigan, to study that very carefully. Let me reference in this context the aforementioned point that Mr. Hegseth plans on purging so-called woke generals, which will facilitate the dispatching of anti-woke military forces into the streets against us. Then there's little Marco Rubio, or Narco Rubio, in the sense that as a young man, his brother-in-law did hard time after selling drugs out of the home of Mr. Marco Rubio, who says he knew nothing about it, although he then lobbied for his felonious brother-in-law to get a real estate license. He has a beef, to put it mildly, with his erstwhile homeland, speaking of Cuba, so you can expect tensions to rise there. Now reference my proposal for our so-called leadership to hold a conference in Havana with our Cuban friends, because we have quite a bit in common. And of course, he's also going to be ratcheting up tensions with Nicaragua and Venezuela, probably Brazil as well. And there's Congresswoman Stefanik, the United Nations ambassador designate, who helped to purge the first Black woman president from Harvard University, speaking of President Clayton Gay, because a daughter of Haitian immigrants, by the way, because of her insufficient enthusiasm for genocide and historic Palestine. So this is a real disaster. And I trust and I hope that those who went for the okey doke and voted for Mr. Trump are now seeking to engage in some sort of procedure to revoke their vote.
Does this send a more of a blanket message to you? Does this point in a particular direction, and you have his previous administration to look back upon to do a compare and contrast with?
Well, remember in the previous administration, he was boasting about trying to seize the oil of Venezuela. Uh, when he talked about Syria, he was boasting about how he was seeking to seize that nation's natural resources. But Mr. Trump is going to have some very rude surprises because he is accumulating enemies by the second, not only in terms of those you suspect, Russia, China, and of course, he's going to try to cut a deal with Russia, which opens up an entire Pandora's box that I could go into, but also the erstwhile allies, Canada, France, in the first place, the European Union, he's going to be trying to slap tariffs on, not to mention his seeking to warm relations with North Korea so as to put pressure on South Korea and Japan. Potentially, if our leadership had any strategic sense, they could organize a broad global anti-Trump, anti-fascist coalition. But alas, I don't think that they have the vision nor the intelligence.
Talk about this interest in cutting a deal with Russia, because one of the things that I have been saying for quite a while is we tend, particularly on the foreign policy side, we tend to look at the foreign policy as though it's a product of the administration of the moment, instead of understanding things may change on the periphery or on the edges, but we're looking at American foreign policy, not necessarily administration foreign policy. Your thoughts on that, and then elaborate on how does Trump move forward with cutting a deal with Russia when he's got to deal with the Brzezinski acolytes that have been responsible for so much of the policy that we've been involved in up to this point.
Well, with regard to the latter, cutting a deal with Russia might not be possible because Russophobia is so deeply ingrained in intellectual circles, political circles, media circles. It's going to be a real stumbling block, and it may not be possible, but clearly the attempt to move away from double containment of Biden, that is to say, containing Russia and China simultaneously, has failed miserably, and it's a sign of the weakness of U.S. imperialism that Mr. Trump and his acolytes have decided that there needs to be a change in the policy. I'm not sure if that change will go forward. And you notice that Chancellor Scholz of Berlin, he called Mr. Putin after 2 years of ignoring him, and then put out this statement as if he were lecturing Putin, when obviously he's trying to cut a deal with Moscow over Ukraine because he sees that Mr. Trump will be in power in less than 60 days. And so the pieces on the chessboard are being reshuffled. But alas, that seems to be ignored by many of our leadership.
What are you making of, at least as it stands right now, some pushback within Republican circles as it relates to Matt Gaetz, as it relates to Pete Hegseth, as the Secretary of Defense and Gaetz as Attorney General? There are those that have sent Republicans that have sent very clear messages to to Trump. Those guys are DOA.
We shall see. As you know, these Republicans like Susan Collins of Maine, they're performance artists. I mean, they give these interviews with journalists breathing fire, but when time comes to take a vote, they're usually on board. And in any case, we all know that there can be recess appointments. That is to say, Mr. Trump has already suggested he can do an end run around the confirmation process, force an adjournment of the House and the Senate, and then have recess appointments, including Mr. Troll himself, Matt Gaetz, the accused pedophile, and he can serve till the end of 25, end of 26. Perhaps that can be rolled over to 27 through 28. And so that's what we're confronting, people.
You know, they're talking about recess appointments, and that makes me think about former President Obama with when he had an opportunity to nominate Merrick Garland and did not do that. And I know that there are some that say, well, it couldn't have been a recess appointment because the Republicans, Mitch McConnell, kept sending somebody in through the Senate to walk through the chamber, so that they technically weren't in recess. But this just shows me a major difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. The Democrats make their moves. And I don't, this is not an endorsement of anything. To me, it's just a comment on reality. The Republicans make their move. They come and punch you in the eye and then challenge you. Okay, hit me back if you want to. The Democrats roll over before the fight even starts, hoping to get their stomachs rubbed.
I think it's utterly explicable. That is to say, the Republicans have a stranglehold on the votes of the so-called white majority. They've been winning it repeatedly ever since the Democrats signed on to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Whoever has that majority has a leg up, just like in Israel, though it has a 20% Arab population. Everybody knows that in order to do anything profound, you need not just an Israeli majority, you need a Jewish majority. Folks don't want to recognize in this similar settler colonial state that there are different rules that apply to the party that controls the settler descendants and the party that's heterogeneous, speaking of the Democrats. Until we wake up to those bitter and brutal realities, we'll always be staring down the barrel of the gun of fascism.
Let's go to Cynthia in Florida on 3. Cynthia, good afternoon. You're going inside the issues here with Wilmer Leon and Dr. Gerald Horne.
Hi, this Cynthia, for Cynthia?
Yes, go ahead.
Hi. I was calling because I feel like there's an echo chamber since the loss of Kamala, and I just want to make sure that we are doing a different approach. She won 74 million votes in 100 days. That's letting us know that people were listening and they were on board with her. But she didn't get 6 million votes who sat out the election, that they voted for Biden. Why? Because of apathy. Apathy was not on our side. It was against us. Why? Because the Democrats are not doing a good job messaging what they're really about. So many people who voted for her voted with the hopes of what she was saying was true, but there wasn't a lot being said. And we need to be honest about that. Why was the border left open? Why was Iran? Why was their money allowed to be given back to them? Why did we end up in Ukraine in the first place? Why are these conversations being had? We're acting like people are stupid and they aren't aware that there are real issues that are not being addressed. And it feels like the radio stations, MSNBC, CNN, are all like ignoring it. Why aren't these conversations being had? And I'm really frustrated as a Democrat because they knew what was on the line. And we allowed ourselves to lose something so big for our people. And we're in so much trouble now. And I don't understand why we thought that people would be stupid and would vote in spite of not having answers.
Thank you, Cynthia. Greatly appreciated. Dr. Horne, your thoughts?
Well, with regard to MSNBC, they need to change their business model. They've been trying to build bridges to the Never Trump Republicans, Nicole Wallace, Michael Steele, Joe Scarborough. You saw Kamala imitate that by campaigning alongside Liz Cheney. The problem with the Never Trump Republicans is they barely have enough to assist a dinner party, let alone a political party. They have no base. And so MSNBC, if it wants to avoid extinction, should be building bridges to those to the left of liberalism. But like the NAACP leadership, I don't expect them to accept that sage advice. With regard to Iran getting their money back, it was their money. The United States should not have confiscated their money in the first place. With regard to the Ukraine escapade, as noted, there's deeply ingrained Russophobic attitudes in intellectual circles, political circles, media circles, a difficult hurdle to overcome. If we had time, I could explain the roots of that. Perhaps I'll come back on another day and do so.
Well, if go ahead and elaborate on that point, at least at a 30,000-foot level.
Well, first of all, there's the Russian Revolution, 1917, with the Soviet Union aiding African liberation, wrecking the cash cow of colonialism and to a degree neocolonialism. Before that, of course, you had Russia supporting Ethiopian Christians as they beat back the invasion of their homeland by Italy in the 1890s. The Western European nations have not forgotten that. Russia, during the U.S. Civil War, sent its massive fleet to the Pacific and the Atlantic coast to support the Lincoln government, enraging the enslaving class, which still has a modicum of influence, to put it mildly, in U.S. circles. So, I mean, I could go on in this vein, but there's a tidbit.
Let's go to Olaf in Detroit on 4. Olaf, you're going inside the issues with Dr. Wilmer Leon and Dr. Gerald Horne. Olaf.
Thank you for taking my call, Dr. Wilmer, to your guest host, Dr. Horne. Dr. Horne, my original question was the percentages of the election, but you guys basically answered that question for me. What I want to know is something a little bit different. Now, this guy was impeached twice when he was president. Am I right?
Yeah.
If you guys remember. Now, doesn't it take a third impeachment and they could throw this guy out? Would that be possible if he got impeached this time in his second term? Would he be qualified to be thrown out the White House?
No, because you have to understand the process of impeachment. There's a difference between the impeachment, which is basically being charged, and then the trial that takes place after that. And in both instances, that he wasn't convicted of anything. As in another example, that was Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was impeached, but not convicted. So there are miles to go before we sleep as it relates to the impeachment issue.
So you mean to tell me those two impeachments just mean nothing? I mean, it's no mark on his record, or?
Well, I mean,
Nothing.
there's a mark on the historic record, but in terms of impacting eligibility to be president, no, he can be impeached 1,000 times. Not convicted.
He never should have been allowed to run. He never should have been allowed to run.
But no, Olaf, you're giving me now sentiment, not law. I understand how angry you are, and I understand why you're angry. But we do have a constitution. There are laws, and based upon, he hasn't been convicted of anything that makes him ineligible to be president.
But he was convicted 34 times on felony counts, Dr. Whitmer.
State charges, not federal charges.
Man, but can you understand what I'm saying? In reality, if you had 34 felony counts,
Olaf, let's get out of our feelings and deal with the law. I understand what you're saying. I hear you, my brother. I truly do. I feel you. But law prevails. Dr. Horne.
Well, not only law prevails, we need to realize there's a double standard. I mean, look at that immunity decision by the U.S. Supreme Court a few months ago. A hypothetical, that is to say, when a president is executing the core powers of his office, then it's presumptively legal and constitutional. Core function of the office, executing U.S. foreign policy. Mr. Trump goes to nation X and says, give my family $100 billion. He's caught on tape. Otherwise, we're going to try to crush you and impose sanctions. My reading of that Supreme Court immunity decision is that would be okay. Now, if a Democrat tried something like that, a party of heterogeneity, the Supreme Court would find a loophole, flip, and that Democratic president would be stationed under the jail.
Appreciate it, Olaf. Again, man, I hear you. I feel you. But one of the problems that we're having in our community is that we are getting wrapped up in our emotions, and those emotions are controlling our thought. And that's not going to get us anywhere. We've got about 2.5 minutes, Dr. Horne. What do you want this audience to take away, having a better understanding based upon this this conversation? And let me say to Tony in Virginia, Lawrence in Texas, Norm in Florida, Rabbi Parker in Texas, Steve in Chicago, Jay, we'll get you all in on the other side because we're going to open phones. Dr. Horne, your thoughts, sir.
Well, I'd just like to reiterate my proposal, which I am deadly serious about. That is to say, the NAACP, the Congressional Black Caucus, and if they're too frightened and still quaking in their boots, then the African People's Socialist Party, the All African People's Revolutionary Party should sponsor a conference in Ottawa, Canada, and or Havana, Cuba. The immediate issue being the impending mass deportation of Haitians, with the detention centers now in the process being built, then slated, I'm afraid to say, for the domestic Black population, people like yourself and myself. It's in our self-interest to proceed on this level. Mr. Trump has numerous enemies abroad, including Canada and Cuba. If we have vision and intelligence, we should try to take advantage of that fact.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis. And folks, you got a rare opportunity to ask directly and hear directly, ask directly to and hear directly from one of the sharpest knives in the drawer, Dr. Gerald Horne. My brother, thank you. Enjoy the rest of the weekend.
Good luck to you.
All right.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.